The air in the John Deere dealership hung thick and heavy, a familiar trinity of smells: new rubber, fresh green paint, and the faint, sharp tang of hydraulic fluid. It was the smell of progress, the smell of money. For most farmers in Black Hawk County, Iowa, in the spring of 1973, it was the smell of hope. For Arthur Miller, it just smelled expensive. He stood at the parts counter, a worn-out hydraulic coupling held in his calloused hand. The chrome on the counter was so clean he could see the reflection of his own weathered face, the deep lines etched around his eyes by sun and worry. He was 48, but looked a decade older, a man made of sinew and quiet resolve. He'd been waiting for 10 minutes while the parts man, a kid barely out of high school, fussed with a computer punch card machine that was supposed to make things faster, but rarely did. From the sales floor behind him, a booming laugh echoed off the high tin ceiling. Art didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Richard Peterson, Rich as everyone called him, was the golden boy of the county. 30 years old, with a smile as wide and white as the grill on a new 40430. He was farming 1,000 acres his father had started with, and was buying more every chance he got. "Stan, you old horse thief, you're telling me this thing's got sound guard body, air conditioning, and a tape deck?" Rich's voice dripped with the easy confidence of a man who'd never known a lean year. Stan, the dealership owner, a man whose belt seemed to be losing a long war with his belly, chuckled obsequiously. "Top of the line, Rich. The 4630 is the king of the row crop tractors. 150 horses at the PTO, quad-range transmission. She'll pull a 7-bottom plow through that gumbo of yours and not even break a sweat. You sign right here, and we can have it delivered by Friday, just in time to get those beans in." Art glanced over his shoulder. Rich was perched on the edge of a massive mahogany desk, a pen in his hand, looking less like a farmer and more like a corporate executive. The tractor in question sat gleaming under the fluorescent lights, a monster of green and yellow steel. Its tires were taller than Art. The cab was a space-age bubble of tinted glass. It was beautiful, Art had to admit, in the way a hungry wolf is beautiful. He turned back to the counter, just as the parts kid finally located the right drawer. "Here you go, Mr. Miller. 1 AR2C6-447 quick coupler. That'll be $9.52. Art pulled a worn leather wallet from the back pocket of his denim work pants. He counted out a $10 bill, the paper soft as cloth from years of use. As the kid fumbled to make change, Rich Peterson sauntered over, Stan trailing in his wake like a pilot fish. "Still trying to piece that old 4010 together, Art?" Rich grinned, clapping Art on the shoulder. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It was a display of power. "I swear, you spend more time wrenching on that thing than you do in the seat." Art pocketed his 48 cents in change and held up the new coupler. "She just needs a little attention now and then, like any good woman." Stan laughed a little too loudly. "Art, we've been over this. We'd give you a fair trade-in on that relic. It's time to step into the modern age. A man can't get ahead turning his own wrenches anymore. Time is money." "My time is my own," Art said, his voice low and even. "So is my money." Rich shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "Look, Art, I respect the old ways. I do. My dad started with a farmall M, same as yours. But times have changed. You got to use the bank's money to make money. Leverage. That's the name of the game now." He gestured grandly toward the new 4630 and the paperwork on the desk. "That tractor, a new 20-foot disc, and that 8-row planter puts my line of credit up to $150,000 this year." He said the number like a badge of honor. "You got to spend big to get big. Stan nodded eagerly. The bank is practically giving money away, Art. Land prices are going up 10% a year. Corn's heading for $3 a bushel. You can't lose. Art looked from Rich's confident smirk to Stan's eager, piggy eyes. He thought of his 320 acres, the last mortgage payment just 2 years away. He thought of his father's words, spoken from a dusty deathbed a decade before. Son, the land will feed you, but the banker will eat you. Own what's yours and owe no man. He looked Rich square in the eye. The dealership suddenly felt quiet. The parts kid had stopped pretending to be busy and was watching. $150,000, Art repeated slowly, tasting the weight of the number. He tucked the new coupler into his shirt pocket. Well, Rich, that's quite a sum. I'll tell you what. He paused, letting the silence stretch. If I had to, I could write a check and pay off my entire farm today. This afternoon. Be done with it all. Can you say the same? The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp as a falling axe. Rich's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even insult, crossed his face before he covered it with a booming laugh. Stan joined in, his belly shaking. Pay it off! That's a good one, Art. Why would anyone do that? That's not how you build an empire. Rich slapped the counter. Art, you're a classic. Never change. He turned and walked back toward the desk, his bravado fully restored. Friday delivery, Stan. And throw in a couple of those John Deere hats for my boys. Art tipped his own faded seed corn cap to the parts kid and walked out the door, the sound of their laughter following him into the bright spring sunshine. He didn't feel angry. He didn't feel embarrassed. He felt a cold, hard certainty settle deep in his gut. He climbed into his dusty Ford F-100 pickup, the V8 engine turning over with a familiar, reliable rumble. As he pulled out onto the highway, he glanced in the rearview mirror at the dealership, at the giant green tractor sitting in the showroom window like a prize pig. It looked like a monument to a future he didn't trust. Before we go any further into this story, before we talk about the sweat and grease and the long years that followed that day, I have to ask you folks, have you ever known a man like Art Miller? A man who saw debt not as a tool, but as a chain? Maybe it was your father, or your grandfather, or a neighbor down the road. A man who the world called stubborn, but who called himself free. Let me know in the comments below. I'd surely like to hear about him. The breakdown came, as it always did, at the worst possible time. It was the first week of May, a solid 10 days behind where Art wanted to be with his corn planting. A wet April had kept him out of the fields, and now the soil was finally fit, a narrow window of opportunity before it baked hard as brick under the Iowa sun. The old John Deere 4010, his main tillage tractor, was pulling a 16-foot field cultivator, churning the black earth, turning under the winter cover crop, and creating the fine, firm seed bed he needed. The tractor had been running like a top all morning. The big 6-cylinder diesel engine hummed its steady, powerful song, a rhythm Art knew better than his own heartbeat. He could tell by the pitch of the engine, by the feel of the vibrations through the steel seat, exactly how hard the tractor was working. He loved this machine. He'd bought it used in '68, a '63 model with 3,000 hours on it. It was simple, strong, and honest. No fancy cab, no radio, just raw power and the smell of diesel exhaust on the wind. He was on his last pass of the North 80 when he heard it. It wasn't a loud bang or a scream of tortured metal. It was more subtle than that. A low, rhythmic, grinding sound that seemed to be coming from the left rear of the tractor. It was a sound that didn't belong. Art immediately pushed in the clutch and throttled down. The engine's roar subsided to a murmur. In the sudden quiet, the grinding was more pronounced. Thump grind, thump grind. Once for every rotation of the big rear wheel, his stomach tightened into a cold knot. He knew, with the certainty of a man who'd spent a lifetime with machinery, that this was not a simple fix. This was deep inside. This was bad. He limped the tractor back to the machine shed, the ugly sound a funeral dirge for his planting schedule. Rich Peterson, working the field across the road with his brand-new 4630 and a 24-foot cultivator, slowed as Art passed. He didn't wave. He just sat high in his air-conditioned cab, a silhouette behind the tinted glass, watching Art's crippled machine limp away. The judgment was as clear as if he'd shouted it across the fence row. Inside the shed, the concrete floor cool and smelling of oil and earth, Art shut the engine down. The silence that followed was heavy with dread. He slid off the seat and knelt beside the left rear wheel. He put his hand on the final drive housing, the massive cast-iron hub that transferred power to the axle. It was hot. Dangerously hot. He could smell the scorched odor of 90-weight gear oil. "Damn it," he whispered to the empty shed. The planetary gears inside that final drive had given up the ghost. It was a known weak spot on the early 4010s if you pushed them too hard, but his was well maintained. It was just old. Metal gets tired. For a moment, he let himself sink. He could call Stan at the dealership. They'd send a truck, haul it in, and have it fixed in a week. The bill would be $1,000, maybe more. Or, Stan would say, he could trade it in on a new one. Sign a note, get back in the field tomorrow. It was the smart thing to do. The modern thing to do. Then he thought of Rich Peterson's mocking laugh. He thought of his father's words. He stood up and wiped his hands on an old rag. "No," he said, this time aloud. "We'll fix it here." The next morning, the machine shed transformed into a surgical theatre. Splitting a tractor of that size was no small feat. First, he drained the thick, honey-colored transmission oil, nearly 15 gallons of it, into a clean drum. Then came the disassembly. He removed the fender, the heavy three-point arms, the PTO shield. Each bolt was a battle, fought with long-handled breaker bars and grunts of exertion. Rust and dirt rained down on his face. He built a cradle of heavy timbers to support the transmission housing. He used his engine hoist, a creaking but sturdy chain fall, to support the front half of the tractor. Then came the most delicate part, rolling the two halves apart. He placed hydraulic jacks under the front end, and with agonizing slowness, he separated the engine from the transmission, inch by inch. The tractor, the symbol of unbreakable strength on his farm, was now in two vulnerable pieces. The sight of the exposed flywheel and clutch was daunting, but the real work lay at the back. He wrestled the 300-pound wheel off with a pry bar and sheer will, rolling it into a corner. Now he could get to the final drive housing. Unbolting the heavy casting was another brutal fight. When the last bolt came free, he pried the housing off. The smell of burnt oil washed over him, acrid and foul. The diagnosis was as bad as he'd feared. The main planetary gear had shattered. 3 of the teeth had broken clean off, and the resulting metal shards had chewed up the other gears and bearings in the assembly. It was a catastrophic failure. It was scrap metal. He spent the next 2 days on the phone. The party line in the kitchen was his only link to the outside world. He'd have to wait for a neighbor to finish her gossip before he could get a dial tone. The John Deere dealer, Stan, was his first call. "A whole new planetary assembly for a 63-4010? Stan whistled. "Hoo boy, Art, you're looking at close to $800 for the parts alone, and that's if I can even find one. They don't exactly keep those on the shelf anymore." There was a pause. "You know that new 4230 we got on the lot? Just see if you can find the parts, Stan." Art cut him off. His next calls were to salvage yards across 3 states. Dusty's in Waterloo, Miller's in Des Moines, a place in southern Minnesota he'd heard about. The conversations were all the same. "A 40s10 final drive? Yeah, sold one last week." Or, "Got one, but it's out of a tractor that burned. Can't guarantee the gears ain't warped." Every day he spent on the phone, and in the shop was a day lost in the field. The sun beat down, the ground was getting harder, and the ideal planting window was slamming shut. His wife, Martha, brought him sandwiches and coffee in the shed, her face etched with a quiet worry she tried to hide. His son, a teenager more interested in cars than tractors, offered to help, but didn't know a wrench from a ratchet. Art was on an island of grease and iron. Finally, on the 4th day, he got a lead. A salvage yard in Nebraska. The man had a complete final drive assembly off a 4010 that had thrown a rod. The gears were good. The price was $300. "You gotta come get it, though," the man rasped over the phone. "Ain't got time to ship it." It was a 6-hour drive each way. He left before dawn the next day in his old pickup, a wad of cash in his pocket. He drove through the rising sun, watching other farmers, his neighbors, already in their fields, their planters rolling, leaving perfect rows in the black dirt. He felt a pang of envy so sharp it was like a physical pain. He saw Rich Peterson's new rig, already halfway done with his corn, a cloud of dust following him like a victory parade. They were all moving forward, while he was driving backward, chasing a ghost of a machine to fix his own. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. This wasn't just about a broken part anymore. It was a test of everything he believed in. The years that followed were, for a time, a vindication of Rich Peterson's philosophy. The mid-1970s roared into the heartland like a freight train loaded with cash. In 1973, President Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, gave his famous command, "Plant fence row to fence row." The massive grain sales to the Soviet Union had sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn, which had been $1.50 a bushel for as long as anyone could remember, shot past $3. Soybeans hit 10. Suddenly, every farmer with a line of credit was a genius. The banks, flush with cash from oil-rich nations, were practically begging farmers to take loans. Interest rates were high, but with inflation running even higher, the real interest rate was actually negative. It was free money, or so it seemed. Rich Peterson became the local legend. He used his skyrocketing land values as collateral to buy more land. He bought the widow Jensen's 160 acres to his east, then the old Smith place to the north. His operation swelled to over 2,000 acres. He built a massive grain drying and storage system on his farmstead, gleaming silver bins that towered over the countryside, a monument to his success. His equipment lineup became a rolling John Deere catalogue. The 4630 was traded in for a new 4840, a V8-powered beast that shook the ground. He was the first in the county to buy an ATA-20 combine, a machine so large it looked like it could harvest a field in a single pass. He hired 2 full-time men to help run it all. At the coffee shop in town, the talk was always about Rich. "Did you see that new 4-wheel drive he's got now?" Heard he paid cash for a new Lincoln Continental for his wife. He was the American dream, writ large in green and yellow. Art Miller, meanwhile, was seen as a relic. He'd gotten his 4010 back together after that desperate trip to Nebraska. The salvaged final drive worked perfectly. He got his corn in, albeit late. The yield suffered a little, but the high prices made up for it. The profit he made that year, and in the years that followed, was substantial. But what he did with it was what set him apart, what made his neighbors shake their heads in bewilderment. He didn't buy more land. He didn't buy a new tractor. His first big purchase was a set of new Firestone 18.4 to 34 tires for the 4010. The old ones were bald and weather-checked, a constant source of worry. The new rubber cost him nearly $1,000, a staggering sum for tires, but it felt like a better investment than a new paint job. His next project was tiling. There was a 40-acre patch on the back of his farm that had always been too wet, a swampy mess in the spring that he had to plant around. The conventional wisdom was to just buy another 80 acres of good ground. But Art saw it differently. Why buy more land from the bank when he could improve the land he already owned? He hired a local tiling company and spent $10,000 of his own cash laying a systematic grid of drainage tile. The next spring, that 40 acres was the best ground he had, yielding an extra 30 bushels per acre. It was a quiet, invisible victory, one that didn't gleam in the sun or make noise at the coffee shop. His biggest moment came in the fall of 1975. He walked into the Black Hawk County Savings and Loan, the same bank that was financing Rich Peterson's empire, and asked to see the bank president, Mr. Abernathy. Art laid his passbook on the polished desk. "Mr. Abernathy," he said, his voice steady, "I'd like to pay off the remaining balance on my farm mortgage." Abernathy, a man with thinning hair and gold-rimmed glasses, looked at him with surprise. The remaining balance was just over $7,000. It wasn't due to be paid off for another 2 years. "Well now, Arthur," Abernathy said, leaning back in his leather chair. "There's no need for that. Your payment record is perfect. With inflation the way it is, you're paying us back with cheaper dollars every year. It's financially prudent to carry that debt." "I'd like to pay it off," Art repeated. Abernathy sighed, a man explaining a complex new science to a child. "Arthur, the most successful operators, men like Rich Peterson, understand leverage. They're using our money to expand. You have significant equity in your land now. We could lend you $250,000 tomorrow to buy that quarter section next to you. You're sitting on a gold mine, and you're refusing to dig." "The only gold I'm interested in is the kind that comes out of the ground in the fall," Art said, "not the kind that comes with a signature and a due date." Reluctantly, the banker drew up the papers. Art wrote the check, his hand not shaking in the slightest. As the banker stamped the papers, "Paid in full," Art felt a weight lift from his shoulders he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying for 25 years. He was 50 years old, and for the first time in his adult life, he owed nothing to anyone. He owned his land, his machines, his house. He was a free man. He shook the banker's hand and walked out into the afternoon sun. He felt 10 feet tall. As he passed the loan officer's desk on his way out, he overheard a snippet of a phone conversation. The officer was talking to a colleague in Chicago. "I'm telling you it's getting tight," the loan officer said, his voice low. "The prime rate just hit 9%. Volcker over at the Federal Reserve. He's not kidding around about wringing this inflation out of the system. Some guys are saying we could see double digits before it's over. Can you imagine? Double-digit interest on these operating loans?" Art paused at the door, the cold glass under his hand. He looked out at Main Street, a brand-new International Harvester, 1086, probably just bought on a note by some young farmer trying to keep up with the Petersons of the world, rumbled past. Art looked at its shiny red paint, its big tires, its comfortable cab. But he didn't see a tractor. He saw a cage on wheels, a rolling tower of debt, and he heard the distinct, chilling sound of a banker's key turning in a lock. A cold wind blew down the street, and for the first time in a long time, Art Miller felt a shiver of fear. Not for himself, but for his neighbors. The first sign of the coming storm was not a cloud in the sky, but a voice on the radio. It was January of 1980. Art was in the machine shed, grinding a valve on the head of his Ford pickup's engine when the news bulletin cut through the country music. President Jimmy Carter, his voice grave and distant, was announcing an embargo on grain sales to the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. Art put down the valve grinder, the high-pitched whine dying slowly. He wiped a greasy hand across his mouth and listened. He didn't know a thing about Afghanistan, but he knew what happened when the biggest buyer in the world market suddenly vanished. The price of corn, which had been hovering near $3, would fall off a cliff. He was right. By spring, the bottom had dropped out of the market. The elevators were posting prices that started with a 1, $1.90, $1.80, $1.75. The numbers were a punch to the gut for every farmer in the county. At the same time, another, more insidious threat was tightening its grip. Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, was waging a brutal war on inflation. The prime interest rate, the number that governed every operating loan and mortgage in the heartland, began to climb like a fever. 10%, 12, 15. For Art, the changes were concerning but not catastrophic. His operating loan for seed and fertilizer was small, paid off every year. With no land or equipment payments, the low grain prices meant a lean year, but not a fatal one. He tightened his belt, put off buying a new set of cultivator shovels, and told Martha they'd be eating more chicken and less beef. For Rich Peterson, the new reality was an existential threat. His entire empire was built on the assumption of high prices and cheap money. Now both pillars had crumbled. His variable rate loans, the ones banker Abernathy had sold him as a brilliant hedge against inflation, were a ticking time bomb. Every time the prime rate jumped, the interest on his massive debt reset higher. He was paying 18, then 20, then a terrifying 21% interest on hundreds of thousands of dollars. The interest payments alone were more than most farmers' entire yearly income. The first visible crack in his operation appeared that fall, during soybean harvest. Rich's massive 88 R20 combine, the pride of the county, sat silent in the middle of a half-harvested field for 3 days. Art could see it from his own property, a wounded green giant sitting motionless under the autumn sky. The talk at the coffee shop was that an electronic sensor in the grain loss monitor had failed. It was a $50 part, but it had to be special ordered from the regional depot in Moline, and the dealership's only certified technician was booked solid for a week. Art, meanwhile, was chugging along in his old John Deere 95 combine, a machine from the late 60s. It was slow, dusty, and loud. It had no cab, no air conditioning, and the only computer on board was the one between Art's ears. But when a bearing went out on the straw walker, Art didn't have to call a dealer. He drove his pickup into town, bought a standard $10 bearing from the local supply store, and had it fixed himself in under 3 hours. He was back in the field, cutting beans, while Rich's $1 million operation was paralyzed by a piece of plastic the size of a thumb. Rich finally got the 8820 running, but the cost was more than just the repair bill and the lost time. It was a chink in his armor of invincibility. People started to whisper. They saw the strain in his face, the way his confident swagger was replaced by a tense, hurried walk. He stopped coming to the coffee shop. He was holding his grain, all of it, in those massive silver bins, refusing to sell at the low prices, betting on a market rebound. But the rebound never came. The grain sat in the bins, a mountain of worthless assets, while the bank's interest clock ticked louder and louder, every second of every day. The winter of 1982 was bleak and bitter, a mirror of the mood that had settled over the farm belt. The snow fell deep, covering the frozen fields, but it couldn't cover the fear. The local paper, once filled with announcements of weddings and anniversaries, now carried a new, dreaded section: notices of foreclosure. Every week, another family's name appeared in the stark, black print. These weren't strangers. They were neighbors, men Art had gone to school with, men who had bet the farm and lost. Farm auction bills were tacked to the bulletin board at the feed mill and the post office. They were grim affairs, held in wind-swept farmyards under grey skies. Families stood huddled together, watching their lives be sold off, piece by piece, to bargain hunters and creditors. The auctioneers, usually jovial men, conducted the sales with a somber efficiency, their rapid-fire chant sounding more like a eulogy than a call for bids. The crisis had a sound, the mournful cry of a new mother selling her grandmother's china for pocket change. It had a smell, stale coffee and desperation in the back room of the bank. And it had a face, Rich Peterson's. His downfall was shockingly swift. The land that had been valued at $3,000 an acre in 1979 was now struggling to fetch $1,000. The bank, seeing its collateral evaporate, called his loans. They wanted their money, and they wanted it now. Rich was trapped. He was, in the cruel parlance of the era, asset rich and cash poor. He owned millions of dollars in land and equipment on paper, but he couldn't make his payments. His first auction was in the spring of '83. It wasn't the home farm, not yet. It was the 200 acres he'd bought to the north, the old Smith place. Art went, not to bid, but to bear witness. He stood at the back of the small crowd, his hands in his pockets, a profound sadness settling over him. He saw Rich standing near the auctioneer's truck, his shoulders slumped inside a brand-new John Deere jacket that seemed too big for him. His face was pale and drawn. He wasn't the golden boy anymore. He was just another drowning man. Stan, the dealership owner, was there too, his face grim. The bank had forced him to repossess Rich's newest equipment, the 4-wheel drive tractor and the 24-row planter, and they were being sold to satisfy the note. The machines went for 50 cents on the dollar. There was no joy in the bidding, only a grim sense of opportunity born of another man's ruin. Art watched Rich's world unravel over the next 2 years. He sold off another farm, then another. He sold his grain bins to a large co-op for a fraction of what he'd paid to build them. He laid off his hired men. His wife's Lincoln Continental was quietly traded for a used Ford Fairmont. The empire was being dismantled, auctioned off to the vultures, until all that was left was the original homestead, the 320 acres his father had started with. But even that was mortgaged to the hilt. Art, by contrast, was a rock in a raging river. His lack of debt was his shield. His costs were minimal: fuel, seed, fertilizer, and repairs he did himself. He could sell corn for $1.70 and still clear a small profit. He wasn't getting rich, but he was surviving. He was holding on. His neighbors, the same ones who had once called him stubborn and old-fashioned, now looked at him with a kind of awe. They'd stop him at the feed mill. "How are you making it, Art?" they'd ask, their voices hushed. "I own what I run," he'd say simply, "and I don't owe the bank a dime." The words, once a mark of his foolishness, had become a profound statement of wisdom. He started getting calls from younger farmers, men on the brink, asking for advice. He'd sit at his kitchen table with them, a cup of coffee in his hand, and look over their balance sheets. He'd show them where to cut, what to sell, how to survive. He never judged them. He saw in their frightened eyes the same gamble Rich Peterson had taken, a gamble they had all been told was the only way to win. One afternoon, Martha found him in the shed, staring at his old 4010. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" she asked softly. Art nodded, running a hand over the tractor's faded green fender. "They're selling the home place," he said, his voice thick. "The bank is foreclosing on the last of it. The auction is Saturday." He felt no triumph, no sense of, "I told you so." He just felt a deep, aching sorrow for a man who had flown too close to the sun, and for a dream that had turned into a nightmare for so many. The day of the final auction was cold for late October, with a raw wind that whipped across the harvested cornfields. The Peterson farmstead, once a showplace of prosperity, looked tired and defeated. The white paint on the big barn was peeling, and weeds grew in the gravel of the long driveway. A large crowd had gathered, a mix of somber neighbors, curious onlookers, and hard-faced bankers in city shoes. Art parked his pickup down the road and walked in. He saw Rich standing with his wife and 2 young sons near the porch of the house they were about to lose. Rich looked like a ghost, his eyes hollowed out. He was staring at the line of equipment in the yard, his life's ambition reduced to a series of auction lot numbers. The centerpiece, the machine that drew the most attention, was the 4840 tractor. It was still a magnificent piece of iron, but it was no longer a symbol of progress. It was a tombstone. Art avoided them, making his way to the back of the crowd. He wasn't here to gloat. He was here to pay his respects, not to a man, but to the death of an era. The auctioneer started with the small items from the shop: wrenches, welders, spare parts. Then came the implements: the plow, the disc, the planter. Each sale was another nail in the coffin. When they got to the 4840, a hush fell over the crowd. This was the main event. Banker Abernathy stood beside the auctioneer, his arms crossed, his face a mask of professional indifference. The bidding was slow and cautious. The men who had the money to buy such a machine were few, and they knew they were in a buyer's market. The price stalled out at a figure that Art knew was less than half of what Rich still owed on it. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Finally, the auctioneer turned to the last, most important item. "All right, folks," his voice boomed over the PA system. "Now we offer the real estate. 320 acres more or less, with house and buildings. A prime piece of Black Hawk County land. What'll you give me to start?" An uneasy silence fell. This was different from buying a tractor. This was buying a man's home, his history, his identity. A lawyer representing an out-of-state insurance company opened the bidding. Another bid came from a large corporate farm operation from the next county. The price climbed slowly, methodically. Art watched Rich's wife turn her face into her husband's shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. Rich stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight, a muscle jumped in his cheek. Art felt a sudden, powerful impulse. It wasn't planned. It wasn't logical. It was something deeper, something that came from the core of his being. He thought of his father's words. He thought of that day in the dealership. He thought of the quiet satisfaction of stamping his own mortgage, paid in full. He raised his hand. "I have a new bidder," the auctioneer shouted, his eyes finding Art at the back of the crowd. A murmur went through the assembly. Art Miller. He didn't have that kind of money. He was just a small-time operator. The lawyer for the insurance company, annoyed, immediately raised the bid. Art countered. The corporate farmer jumped back in. The 3 of them went back and forth, the price rising in $5,000 increments. The crowd was silent, their heads turning from one bidder to the next as if watching a tennis match. Rich Peterson finally looked over and saw Art, his eyes wide with disbelief. When the price reached a number that made Art's own stomach clench, the corporate farmer shook his head and dropped out. It was just Art and the insurance company. The lawyer, a slick man in a suit, conferred with his client on a cell phone, then raised his paddle one last time. The auctioneer looked at Art. The entire county seemed to be holding its breath. Art thought of the cash he had, the profits from years of frugal living and careful management, sitting safe in certificates of deposit at the bank, earning interest instead of costing it. It was almost everything he had. He gave a single firm nod. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel slamming down. "To Arthur Miller." A collective gasp went through the crowd. For a moment, there was just the sound of the wind whistling around the corner of the barn. Then, Art started walking. He didn't walk toward the auctioneer's truck to sign the papers. He walked straight through the crowd, which parted for him like the Red Sea. He walked directly to Rich Peterson. Rich stared at him, his face a mixture of confusion, shame, and a flicker of something Art couldn't name. "Art, I don't understand," Rich stammered. Art looked him square in the eye. His voice was low, meant only for Rich. "This is good land, Rich. Your father worked it. You worked it. It shouldn't be owned by a company in Des Moines." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I'll be needing someone to farm it. I'm getting too old to handle another 300 acres myself." Rich's mouth opened, but no words came out. "The house is yours," Art continued quietly. "You and your family can stay. We'll work out a rental agreement on the land, a crop share lease. Something fair. Something that gives you a chance to get back on your feet." Rich's composure finally broke. The arrogant, confident man Art had known for years dissolved, and in his place was just a broken farmer. Tears welled in his eyes and streamed down his weathered cheeks. He tried to speak, choked, and then simply nodded, a gesture of profound, bottomless gratitude. Art clapped him once on the shoulder, the same gesture Rich had used on him in the dealership all those years ago. But this time, it wasn't a show of power. It was an act of grace. He turned and walked away to sign the papers, leaving Rich Peterson standing in the middle of his ruined empire, having just been handed the one thing he thought he'd lost forever: a future. In the years that followed, the story of that auction became a local legend. Art Miller never became an empire builder. He continued to farm his own land and lease the Peterson place back to Rich, who, humbled and wiser, slowly rebuilt a smaller, more sustainable operation. The two men, once rivals, developed a quiet, respectful friendship, forged in the crucible of the crisis. They were often seen helping each other, Art showing Rich how to weld a broken part on an old machine, Rich helping Art with the heavy lifting that got harder as the years went by. Art's son, David, who had once been so eager to leave the farm, came home from college with an agriculture degree and a new respect for his father's ways. He saw that the shiny paint and big numbers weren't what mattered. What mattered was the land and your freedom upon it. One crisp fall afternoon, years later, Art stood with his grandson, a boy of 10, in the machine shed. The boy was looking at the old 4010, its paint faded, its tires cracked with age, but its engine still running as strong as ever. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why don't we get a new tractor, like the ones on TV, with a computer and air conditioning?" Art smiled and knelt, putting a hand on the boy's shoulder. He pointed to the tractor. "See this machine?" he said. "It's honest. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. It's all steel and iron and grease. When it breaks, you can see the broken part. You can hold it in your hand. You can fix it. But the most important thing about this tractor, son, is that it's ours. Every bolt, every wire, every tire. We don't rent it from the bank." He looked out the big shed door across the fields of black dirt that stretched to the horizon, land that was his, free and clear. The setting sun cast a golden light over everything. "Your great-grandfather told me something a long time ago," Art said, his voice soft with memory. "He said the land will feed you, but the banker will eat you. Some people build empires of debt. We built a life of freedom. Never forget the difference." The boy looked from the old tractor to his grandfather's face, etched with the lines of a long, hard, and ultimately victorious life. He didn't fully understand all of it then, but he knew he was hearing the most important lesson he would ever learn. He reached out and placed his small hand on the tractor's massive rear tire, feeling the solid, reliable strength of the old iron and of the man who stood beside him.